So, thank you, Jenny, for that introduction, and I'm honored to be asked to come and speak with you from across the pond. Perhaps it's worth kind of pondering that pond for a minute as a body that's getting warmer and warmer. And while it's not a landscape in the conventional sense, its condition certainly affects everything else on Earth. And the fact that it's getting warmer and warmer and increasingly acidified and incapable of sequestering carbon makes it a very, very volatile pond indeed. And so I'm feeling very much kind of connected to you in a way that was beautifully suggested by Andy's talk, where we are all within this thing we're calling nature, whether we like it or not. And as a kind of segue from Andy's great presentation, I thought I would give you a little sort of brief meditation on where I'm coming from here in North America, and specifically in the United States, where ideas about nature are just intractably politicized and tangled up in our deep and often troubling history of colonialism, such that now even birds cannot escape the ongoing debate about monuments and names and revisionism. Just a few days ago, National Public Radio here reported that an insurgent group of American ornithologists are now calling for the renaming of a number of bird species because they were given the names of people who in the 19th century were either slave owners or advocates of the institution of slavery. So for example, Bachman's warbler, which you see in the beautiful painting by John James Audubon at Wright, is now up for revision in its name because Bachman, a Lutheran minister from South Carolina, was a proponent of slavery. And I think that this is sort of a fascinating example of how everything is up for grabs when it comes to nature and politics and the history of colonialism. And as an art historian, and sometimes a museum exhibition curator, I'm keenly interested in how the telling of history, including the history of art, has increasing relevance today. And so even though I'm feeling a little self-conscious and inadequate after these wonderful presentations about contemporary art and science and activism, I do truly believe that the way we frame history and the history of art is absolutely immediate in its relevance. As a way of giving you a little bit of a visual sort of introduction to the way I approach works of art, I thought I would show you a work that was actually not included in the Nature's Nation exhibition that Jenny mentioned, but it was reproduced in the big book that we published alongside that exhibition. It's a little painting by an American artist named Xavier Cortada. It's only about, I don't know, 20 centimeters wide. And it's made of water and pigment and sediment that the artist collected while he was on a residency as a fellow, a National Science Foundation fellow at the McMurdo Station on Ross Island in Antarctica about 10 years ago. And there, working alongside climate scientists who are doing research onto the deep history of carbon in the atmosphere and climate change over millennia, he borrowed ice from core samples that these scientists were extracting from the Antarctic surface. And he melted the ice, turning it into water, which he mixed with pigment and sediment from the Antarctic surface to create a series of what he called ice paintings that were his own kind of spin or riff on landscape art as a way of sort of making a number of points. One point had to do with the instability of that continent, that supposed landscape of Antarctica, as a result of climate change. Polar ice, as we know, is rapidly becoming destabilized as a result of global warming. And in his seemingly abstract and non-objective works, he nonetheless registered that sense of instability, that increasingly aqueous nature of that continent, with pictures like the one you see at right, which he, in this case, titled Astrid, named for one of the coastal regions of Antarctica. He was also, in his own way, commenting on art history, because he knew that abstract paintings like this inevitably conjured a whole history of modernist abstraction, embodied in works like the one you see at left by Helen Frankenthaler from sort of the heyday, the heroic period of American abstract expressionism in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, that's a moment that scientists and most of us now associate with what's called the Great Acceleration of global warming and climate change following World War II, as industrial production and mass consumption generated unprecedented levels of greenhouse gases. And so in another layer of signification, this little painting by Cortada titled Astrid was a kind of meditation on how our understanding of abstraction, how our understanding of art itself and its embeddedness in certain kinds of histories was maybe sort of inextricably entangled in a broader history of environmental conditions. Cortada, in an email exchange with me, articulated his understanding of this particular painting and the series to which it belonged when he wrote to me, "With the ice paintings, I wanted to melt the very ice that threatened to melt and drown my city, Miami." He lives in Miami. That's where he does his work. But he sees himself as a citizen of Miami very much imbricated with the larger world as a result of climate change. The work, as he said, beautiful and serene, would become a precursor of horrors to come. I melted the ice on paper to create the works, adding paint and sediment. The works were made in Antarctica, about Antarctica, using Antarctica as the medium provided to me by the very researchers who inform us about Antarctica. But as he went on to explain to me in more detail in this conversation, he very much understood these pictures about and of Antarctica to be very much about and related to his life in Miami, where nuisance flooding and coastal erosion were becoming increasingly difficult problems and impossible to ignore. What had been sort of seasonal tidal floods have become, daily or nearly daily occurrences as a result of sea level rise and changes in this ocean behavior. And so he decided to use this series of ice paintings that he had made in Antarctica as part of a public art project, a collaborative project titled Underwater Homeowners Association, where, working with local school children, he and they blew them up on a kind of colossal scale in a number of locations around Miami as a way of marking sites in the Miami urban region that were particularly vulnerable to this new condition of nuisance flooding and coastal vulnerability. Marking these sites not only with blown up versions of his paintings reproduced by the community, in the community, but also associating them with numbers indicating the number of feet that the ocean was expected to rise in those locations, marking their precarity and vulnerability, in a way connecting Miami to Antarctica and to the larger pond that has become increasingly volatile in our time. So this is the kind of thing that interests me as an art historian. Even though I'm trained in more historical art, I find myself constantly tacking back and forth between past and present in my work. Just a brief kind of survey of my work here. I'm showing you some covers of my earlier books, along with some of the course syllabi for courses that I teach at William & Mary on art and ecology, art and environmental justice, and the environmental humanities. For the past 15 years or so, I've been kind of working to drag my colleagues in art history sort of kicking and screaming from the comfortable confines of that disciplinary silo into a more interdisciplinary conversation with environmental history, the environmental humanities, and discussions of environmental justice. And when I first tried to do this about 15 years ago, I really ran into a brick wall. I proposed a conference session to the College Art Association on sort of greening art history, and it was rejected. So I sent the same proposal to the American Studies Association, which was a more interdisciplinary scholarly group, and they accepted it. And that eventually became this book that you see in the center, titled A Keener Perception, Ecocritical Studies in American Art History, which I think is the first book that puts the words eco-criticism and art history together in a title. And since then, I've been trying to kind of push this envelope repeatedly. I really kind of made my own personal discovery of the power of eco-critical thinking in relation to art history when I was working on an American artist named Thomas Eakins, one of whose landscape / genre paintings you see at the right from the 1870s, showing rowers, athletic rowers on a river at Philadelphia in the 1870s. And the more I researched into the environmental history of that context, the more I realized that Eakins, in paintings like this, had provided a kind of sanitized view of that community, which was already at that time deeply marked by industrial development, the railroad, and horrible conditions of pollution from sewage and cholera and typhoid. In fact, the artist's own sister died of typhoid in these years, a disease caused by human waste and human pollution, and yet his art did not acknowledge these conditions in any way. So to me, at that time, working on Eakins 15 years ago, landscape aesthetics were more of a kind of filter of reality than a conveyor of reality. Although maybe that registers something about my particular American point of view and the sort of politics around that. There's no question that the pre-Raphaelites in England were much more sort of documentary in their approach. But from my perspective in the United States, knowing what I knew about the real conditions on the ground where Eakins was working, it seemed like there was a huge disconnect, and I've been kind of exploring that disconnect ever since. The culmination, or the recent culmination of this mode of inquiry, this sort of eco-critical art history, as I call it, was this exhibition that Jenny mentioned, titled Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which I co-curated with a scholar at Princeton University's Art Museum back in 2018 and 19. The exhibition explored 400 years of American art history in relation to environmental history and questions of environmental justice. And so in a sort of almost insanely ambitious project, we envisioned basically retelling the history of American art through this perspective of environmental history and environmental justice. And there you see pictures of the different venues, the museum venues where the exhibition was held, the Princeton University Art Museum, and then the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, just outside Boston, a wonderfully kind of interdisciplinary museum of history and art, and then the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, founded by Alice Walton of the Walmart fortune out in Arkansas. And I think Jenny said she saw the exhibition there. Anyway, a great venue, although speaking of entanglement, you know, Walmart as a corporation is deeply implicated in all sorts of questions about environmental justice and pollution and workers' rights and what have you. But we saw the opportunity to have this show reach an enormous audience there as maybe worth the trade-off. And so there we are again within a kind of entangled situation that's inescapable, and I think very much indicative of where we are today. There is no outside, as Andy said, and that idea, which I initially encountered in the writings of the philosopher Timothy Morton, is kind of key to my understanding of art history. Art helps us recognize our embeddedness within conditions which are inescapable and which sort of foster, I think, an ethical engagement of various ways, in various ways. As an art historian, I'm trying to make my work in art history engaged and responsible in new ways. The cover of this book makes its own statement about landscape imagery, to be sure, but also a broader point about our vision of eco-criticism in art history. What you see here are two works of art juxtaposed. At left, Albert Bierstadt's 19th century romantic landscape representing Bridal Veil Falls at Yosemite, a place in California that would eventually become a US national park, but which already in the middle of the 19th century was regarded by artists like the romantic painter Bierstadt as a kind of Edenic paradise. And it's that vision of Eden that was one of the ideas that our exhibition was meant to actually interrogate. Although the title, Nature's Nation, which comes from a 1960s study of American cultural politics, that title seems to evoke a kind of nationalism and a sort of patriotic politics of nature. It really is meant to be ironic. And we very much intended to place the word nature and nation both in quotes as a way of sort of putting them on view as ideological constructs. And landscape paintings like Bierstadt's vision of Yosemite were very much bound up in a kind of American 19th century vision of manifest destiny, you know, a US program of conquest of North America that was deeply political, deeply ideological, premised on assumptions about a kind of white nationalist entitlement to this continent of America that enabled the displacement of indigenous communities from places like Yosemite and all over the West. And the fact that Bierstadt was actually a European immigrant who was, in a sense, importing a European aesthetics of landscape painting in its sublimity and picturesque forms is, I think, indicative once again of this long arc of historical cultural activity that needs to be kept in mind. These are not paintings that are merely documenting, but they are, in a sense, asserting ownership of a place for a certain nation and a certain part of that nation at the expense of others. That sounds, you know, angry, I know, but over the years I've become very troubled by the implications of landscape painting, at least in the United States context, where it went hand in hand with the ideology of national expansion and manifest destiny and Indian removal. And so as a kind of antidote or alternative to that, we placed on the front cover of the book Valerie Hegarty's Fallen Bierstadt of 2007, a 21st century sort of reprise or a revisionist vision of that very same painting by Bierstadt, which the artist Hegarty, meticulously reproduced. She's a skilled painter who knows how to make a romantic landscape painting, but she does so deliberately in order to kind of deconstruct it and to reveal the holes in its ideological apparatus. And she does so, by painting it on foam core and then subjecting it to a kind of violence with blowtorches and leaving the dregs, the sort of ruins below on the ground, which are very much a part of the work when it's displayed normally at the Brooklyn Museum, and also the way it was transported to our various venues of Nature's Nation. All of those pieces were meticulously gathered up and then placed in a kind of ruinous disarray on purpose as a way of signaling this artist's skepticism about the entire tradition of romantic landscape painting and its ideological entanglement in American, processes of empire. And so it's not necessarily to be read as an attack on Yosemite or on nature, really, as much as it is a kind of cautionary critique of landscape aesthetics and the way in which they, at least in the United States context, have tended to lend themselves, especially during the 19th century, to a kind of imperial, an affirmation of imperial practices. I mean, the Bierstadt painting at left shows two deer. The native people who lived here were forcibly removed by the US Army to domesticate that space, to make it safe for tourists who were, white American tourists who wanted to go there to have a kind of privileged experience of what they took to be nature, a kind of pristine, emptied, evacuated nature. Another kind of encounter like that appeared in the very first gallery of the exhibition, where we showed the work of yet another European immigrant artist to the United States, Thomas Moran, a British-born landscape painter, very much steeped in the traditions of Turner and other Romantic artists, who made himself famous for a series of a couple of dozen pictures of Yellowstone National Park, which was established in 1872 as the very first US national park. What you see at left was the work that we were able to borrow for the exhibition from 1893, showing once again a kind of evacuated vision of pristine nature, idealized as sort of uninhabited and therefore inviting to tourists as a place that could be experienced in an as a sort of immediate or unmediated way. At least that was the idea. And we put that imperialist vision of nature in conversation with another work of contemporary art, the one you see at right by Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who is a contemporary Native American art from the West, who is very familiar with the whole history of, American Indian dislocation and reservation politics, the ways in which people in her community were forcibly removed from places like Yellowstone to government-controlled reservations as a way of organizing the settlement of the West for Anglo-American settlers. And Smith, I think, brilliantly represents the United States as this sort of fortress-like continental nation with dark borders that are everywhere sort of transgressed by dripping paint and Native American pictograms oozing across the borders as a way of indicating how even this most kind of balkanized, heavily militarized, bordered nation is still porous and cannot repress its ancient history of Native American culture, despite all of its colonial efforts. The title, Browning of America, refers explicitly to a recent United States Census report that indicates that the United States will become a majority minority nation by the middle of the 21st century, such that people of European descent will no longer be the majority of the population. And that's a reality that's everywhere informing our politics today, with all of the efforts to kind of hinder democratization of voting. The writing is on the wall of a major demographic and political shift that the forces of conservative politics are trying to stop in every way possible. And Smith brilliantly conveys that idea here, both politically and environmentally, where the Browning of America could also be read as a kind of well, she regards the demographic shift as a positive development of democratization, but the Browning of America could also be a reference to the environmental impact of corporate oil interests, which are everywhere tarnishing the landscape, and specifically on Native American lands where pipelines are every day being built, threatening water resources in communities like hers. I'm probably already running short of time, so let me briefly take you through the structure of our exhibition, which was organized in three large kind of chrono-spatial categories: colonization and empire, industrialization and conservation, and ecology and environmentalism, sort of tracking an arc of growing environmental awareness and consciousness over time, as well as a kind of politics of environmental justice throughout. So in colonization and empire, we looked at sort of 18th and early 19th century visions, not only of landscape, but also of science, which during that period were devoted to kind of categorizing and classifying and organizing understandings of nature, typically in a kind of hierarchical way that placed species in a sort of scale of nature, and then species of plants and animals, as in the work of Alexander von Humboldt, in their kind of climate zones, sort of a kind of early understanding of ecological relationships. But we also looked at landscape paintings like those of the famous, another famous American romantic painter, Thomas Cole, whose vision of a sort of settler cabin in the woods was juxtaposed with another 21st century work of a Native American artist directly responding to that imagery of the cabin in the woods as another vision of colonial politics. Yet another dimension of the exhibition was concentrated on art materials themselves. We tried to move away from simply talking about representation. How did artists see and represent nature and emerging understandings of environmental relationships? We sought to explore the materials of art themselves as embodying those relationships. So for example, by displaying this beautiful 18th century mahogany chest, this gave us an opportunity to explore the sort of economics of resource extraction concerning mahogany as a material that came from a certain species of tree, which was being rapidly deforested in the Caribbean with enslaved labor. So the forces concerning that were so aggressive and so dramatic that it's basically turned entire species of trees into endangered species while exacerbating the politics of injustice in that region. Industrialization and conservation. Here we see juxtaposed with an even more marked sense within various works of art of the growing human impact on the land and other ecologies as a result of industrialism and war. We also see a kind of emerging sort of artistic awareness of the need for conservation and the need to resist those very forces of destruction. And again, the presence of Native American art. This was one of the kind of enormous topics of discussion we had in organizing the exhibition, the need to incorporate Native American art every step of the way as a way of making this not just a story of sort of either white Anglo-Saxon manifest destiny or a kind of messianic white discovery of ecological conservation, but a kind of conversation across communities and between communities about different visions and understandings of nature. Finally, ecology and environmentalism, concentrating on the 20th and 21st centuries, a growing awareness not only of human impact and the emergence of a conscious sense of ecological activism and scientific knowledge of ecology, but also a kind of artistic activism and politics embodied notably in works like Robert Rauschenberg's Earth Day print produced in 1970 to mark the world's first Earth Day celebration, a work widely distributed to raise artistic and cultural awareness about environmental activism. And then most recently, a work like the one you see in the lower right-hand corner by yet another Native American artist, Kanupa Hanska Luger's Mirror Shield project that he undertook as part of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in the West during 2016 and 2017, mobilizing the community to resist the construction of another oil pipeline that would threaten the water resources of that community. And the mirror shields, produced with very inexpensive materials, were meant to reflect the image of the police who were there harassing protesters back upon themselves as a way of confronting them with their own sort of ethical obligation to consider themselves as part of this community whose interests they needed to defend rather than the interests of the oil companies that wanted to threaten those interests. I'm pleased to say that the exhibition, which traveled for a year and was seen by over 100,000 people, was well received generally in the press. The reviewer for the Wall Street Journal didn't like our political angle, called us, another example of political correctness, but I take that as a compliment. After the exhibition was done, I went off to a nice research fellowship at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, where I was part of a cohort of scholars. We're all working on art and ecology from various art historical points of view, using the Getty's just abundant resources in art historical research in this magnificent setting on a hill in Santa Monica. And yet even there, we were not immune or safe from the realities of ecology, as we discovered in during one of the many wildfires that have been inflicting the Southern California region. One night in October of 2019, we were forced to vacate not only the Getty complex, but our Getty housing apartments, because the latest wildfire was so close to the institution that everything had to shut down and we had to move away. And the Getty was safe. It has state-of-the-art, fire protection equipment. But the fact that a group of scholars studying art and ecology came face to face with the ecological realities of climate change and wildfire in Southern California, I think has its own lesson about being within the realities and not being able to escape them. And so I think that the lessons are learned, and I consider myself lucky to have been a part of that experience and the exhibition that I just described. But I see myself as really no longer an Americanist, but a kind of global art historian connected with the world. This is a view of the fire from our apartment complex at 3 a.m, the night of October 28th, 2019. Ecology was made very real for us that night, and it continues to be so for me today as an art historian. Thanks very much, and I'm sorry if I went over time.